Today, let's look at a few examples of Yum Audio's Slap plugin in action. But first, I'm doing a giveaway for a few free copies of Slap. Sign up using the link in the video description to enter the random drawing by this date. If you watch the whole video, I've hidden a giveaway code somewhere in the subtitles that you can enter to double your odds of winning, so turn those on to find it. Yum Audio did give me a copy of their plugins to try, as well as the copies for the giveaway, but they haven't seen this video before releasing it, and the opinions here are entirely my own. I'll show you a few examples and let you decide what to think. The main use of Slap is to make your drums hit harder. For our first example, let's use its Transient shaper on a drum loop. This loop already sounds good, but I want it to be a little tighter in my mix. Let's turn off everything but the Transient shaper. The snap knob really sharpens the Transient. The tight knob shortens the release. You can already hear how much tighter it is. I'll turn up the tame knob to reduce some of the higher frequencies. Now let's add the clip module to put a bit of distortion back in. You can move it before or after the shaper. If you want a good before-after comparison with the original loop, you'll need to adjust the output gain to match the original volume. Next, I'm going to use the clip replacer to add more punch to the sound. You have a lot of built-in transients, or you can drag in your own. I'm going to use this built-in one. You can solo the transient if you'd like to hear it by itself. I'll change the mode to layer rather than the default of replace. You can adjust the transient settings to taste. In this example, you may have noticed that the hats get a lot louder and a few of the weak ones are missed. One option is to use Slap's gate setting to try to filter those out from processing. Other options are to use an EQ, or if you have the drum loop separated, you could always process the hat separately and then balance the volume. Here's another quick example of Slap's Transient shaper. First, I'll start with this drum loop. Now, I'll pass it through a granular effect to mutate it and to add some stereo interest. I really like how this sounds now, but it's a little weak. This is where Slap comes in. All I'm doing here is using the Transient shaper and layering on a soft transient using the click replacer. Here's it with just the Transient shaper. And here's adding the modified transient. You may have noticed that I'm using external LFOs to vary the sound of the added transient. This isn't needed, but can add a little more movement to some sounds. You can solo the click like this. It already sounds pretty good, but you can use the LFOs to add a little more motion for certain sounds. I'll talk more about this in a bit. I've also turned up the tame knob to reduce the intensity of the high frequencies a bit. Here's what it sounds like in context. Of course, Slap has other modules to fine-tune each component of your drum. Fat adds fatness using multiband compression and EQ. Clap adds a synthesized noise clap to your sound. Sub adds tuned low-frequency thump. And Spray adds some sizzle. You also have a few effects to further polish your sound, such as Squash, Low Cut, Tame to reduce high frequencies, Tune, and the global effects amount. Here's a few examples where I've made subtle changes to a few drum sounds and then volume matched it. Other ideas are to use Slap to process drum samples that you recorded, as well as drum samples made from Foley sounds. Although many of the examples I've shown you so far have been subtle, you can use slap for a lot more than tightening your drums. It can add a whole lot of character to them. Let me show you a few of the awesome presets that come with it. For a final example, let's use slap on something melodic. We're going to start with an interesting pad sound. Next, we'll add some volume automation to carve out some rhythm. There are a few ways to modulate the volume here. You can draw it in using automation, or use a plugin to help out. I'm going to use Kilohertz free Transient plugin. You can play with the pattern, envelope, and mix amount to taste. I'll start with these settings. You can always go back and adjust it later. Now let's use slap to make it hit harder. In this example, we'll primarily use the transient shaper. The snap knob makes a transient hit harder. The tight knob cuts back on the release. Set it to where it sounds good to you. Now let's enhance the transient further using the click module. Pick a sample from the defaults that you like, or add your own by dragging it in. I'll use this sample. For this sound, I'll also change the mode to layer rather than replace. Now if you solo the click, you'll notice that it sounds a little static. This is fine for most sounds, but if you want to add more variation, you can tweak the click by adjusting the pitch, timbre, and gain. If you have Ableton Suite, you can use the Ableton LFO tool. I'm setting the modulation to fast and random, and then mapping it to the slap click module's timbre control. You can already hear a difference. I'll put the LFO on all three controls and adjust the settings. If at any point you don't like the sound, you can adjust the modulation strength or turn off the modulation on one of the controls. Here's what the soloed click sounds like with this modulation. Here's what it sounds like in context. I'm going to finish this by adding a little bit of compression with the squash knob and turn up the tame knob a bit to reduce some of the high end. At this point, you can easily experiment with different samples and modulation patterns. Here's a few more ideas you can try. You can adjust the FX amount to bring the effects in and out to add some movement. You can also blend it back into the original sound. Since this is a melodic sound, you can use the tune knob for some wild effects. For a really wild effect, detune it while blending it in with the original sound. Finally, don't forget that you can drag in your own samples into the click module. I found this plugin to be very useful and will definitely be using it in my music. Let me know what you think in the comments below.